Hello and welcome to the Tour de France podcast with humansevent.com. My name is Richard Moore. I'm joined this evening by Lionel Birnie.
Good evening, Richard.
And Daniel Friebe.
Good evening, Richard.
Lionel, tell us where we are.
Well, we're in a rather nice restaurant which has plate glass windows allowing a view of the quite spectacular Mont-Saint-Michel in the middle distance there. Anyone who watched the time trial on TV today would have been impressed by the village perched on the rock there. But I gather, Daniel, up close it isn't quite as spectacular as it appears from a distance.
No, not really, Lionel. It's pretty much one tacky souvenir shop after another. I seem to remember they do a fine line in. Remember those rainbow-coloured rubbers you could buy at National Trust houses and any kind of tourist attraction really. I seem to remember I bought one of those from Mont-Saint-Michel. That was the legacy, of my visit.
To be fair, that was a few years ago you visited though, wasn't it? So by now they probably
could have had a complete overhaul.
Yeah, they've probably now got an Apple store and a Starbucks.
Yeah.
Looks like our starters are arriving, chaps. This is our first podcast over dinner, so excuse any sounds of clunking cutlery.
There's always clunking in this podcast, Rich.
Of all the starters to order when you're simultaneously recording a podcast, I wouldn't have thought an enormous bowl of mussels was the best one, Lionel.
I think it's the appropriate starter. We're by the sea. They smell deliciously fresh. I'm going to tuck in.
Well, no, I might not hear much from Lionel in this first segment, and tonight we've got a few things to talk about. We're going to talk about today's stage, first individual time trial, won by Tony Martin. In the second part, we've got the first part rather, we've got a little interview with Richie Porte about today and about still sort of talking about what happened on Sunday to him. Part two, we've got an interview with Brian Cookson, who is running for UCI president, and we'll be talking a bit about that. I should also point out that on humansevent.com there is a interview with Brian Cookson that's gone up, and there's also a bit more cycling content on humansevent.com at the moment. Robert Penn asked the question, does a bike have feelings? Robert Penn, the author of It's All About the Bike, his quest to build the perfect bike. I had a little read of that article, and he mentions that he gives all his bikes names. The line that stood out for me was, when I was a boy, I knew a man who had a sit-on lawnmower called Bernard. Actually, speaking of Bernard,
he's out there.
Bernard is here.
I think he's spy him from here.
I think he's coming into this quite posh restaurant. Anyway, today's stage, chaps, it was won by Tony Martin, quite narrowly in the end. It looked for a while as though Chris Froome might beat him. Froome was up at the first couple of time checks, but I think the wind picked up during the day and that might have helped Tony Martin. Very good win for him. He was in the hot seat for about 4.5-5 hours. Any thoughts on today's stage? It was quite boring, wasn't it?
Unfortunately, it wasn't the most action-packed time trial. I mean, the time trials in the Grand Tours, you like to see a little bit of movement in the overall classification, people moving up, people moving down, or failing that, you want to see a lot of changes in who's actually leading the stage. And Tony Martin, as one of the earlier starters, set down a time that wasn't going to be beaten by anybody really, other than Froome. And so we knew the result of the stage was between those two, Tony Martin and Chris Froome, from pretty much lunchtime onwards, didn't we?
None of the other overall contenders even finished in the top 10. I think it was a stage that really rubber-stamped Froome's status as favourite. It increased his lead massively. He's now almost 3.5 minutes up on Valverde, almost 4 minutes up on Contador. Malema is riding very well into third. He was 11th on the stage. Daniel, any thoughts?
Unfortunately, I missed it, Rich. I missed the stage. Pretty much. I was off on a covert mission. I didn't see an awful lot. I'm just looking through the results. I'm very surprised by Thomas de Gent's performance. Mm-hmm. He came into this race with a lot of doubts. I think not particularly good form. One of the quotes of the tour so far, actually, or one of the most mystifying quotes, I think I put it on Twitter the other day, Pierre Roland said, he said, De Gent is De Gent. Almost Aristotelian.
Really? Why?
I don't have no idea. No, I think he was referring to De Gent. I think wheel sucked him all the way up a climb a few days ago and took the points at the end.
That's right. They were I think he was thinking King of Mountains, wasn't he?
Yes.
De Gent.
Yes. No massive surprises.
He pulls out the odd really good performance again, doesn't he?
He does, quite erratic.
Surprising rider.
Yeah.
He missed the tour last year because he was getting married, if you recall. after a great ride at the Giro.
I would say after the stage today, the Dutch Belkin team are pretty happy. They were all back slaps and smiles when both Tendam and Mollema came into the little area, sort of a dusty kind of car park just behind the finish line, where they'd set up the bikes on rollers for Mollema and Tendam to warm down, and they look really satisfied with their performances, even though they've lost quite a chunk of time to Chris Froome. They've got 2 riders in the top 10, Mollema 3rd, Tendam 6th overall, and they're not going to win the Tour, but they're on course for a pretty solid overall result, which, considering they've just got this new sponsor, Belkin, that's probably about as much as they could ask for, and they've still got the chance of a stage win, perhaps. A little bit later on in the Tour. So,
yeah, it's hard though, isn't it?
It's very much a case that for the other teams, they're sharing the crumbs that have fallen off Chris Froome's table, really.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard for either of those two to win a stage, really, given that they are quite high up overall.
Well, not for them. Sorry, I didn't mean
for another rider.
Yeah, maybe Gesink if he's.
I think the Alpe d'Huez stage is always a huge one for the Dutch. Going up there twice, they will be very, very motivated for that stage. But maybe the way it's looking at the moment, the general classification, Haysink will be the only one with any real liberty to go in a break. It'll be difficult to see one of those two winning a la Pedal. Yeah.
Well, the other incident that happened today was Mark Cavendish. Nothing to do with your covert mission at all, Daniel, was it?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah, you've sworn to secrecy, I know.
Not really. So
you've been assisting Mark with writing his second book, haven't you?
I'm not sure about that, but I've been at his hotel this afternoon
and speaking. Punctuation.
I've been.
Did you do his laundry?
I hope not. Not today.
Anyway, we ought to explain what the big story is.
So today, we shouldn't joke either. Although Chris Froome attempted a little joke in the press conference, didn't he? He said,
I wasn't there, Rich. I missed it, as you know.
The story is that Mark Cavendish today was booed from start to finish.
Yes.
Patrick Lefevre came out afterwards and said he thought that was because people blamed Cavendish for the crash yesterday with Tom Wheelers when he collided with Tom Wheelers. He was booed from start to finish, and at one point liquid was thrown at him, which he reckoned to be urine. I think Alessandro Taglier, his press officer, was in the car following him, and he confirmed that he thought it was urine too. So did Lefevre. I think it's been urine tested, but he seemed pretty convinced that it was urine that was thrown at him, which is a new. I've not heard of that before. I've heard of beer being thrown at riders. Certainly heard of them being booed and jeered. It's not that common. Happened in 2004 with Armstrong on Alpe d'Huez, didn't it? And famously with Eddie Merckx in 1975 was attacked by a spectator. But these kind of incidents are very rare. What's your take on it, Daniel?
I think Mark was most upset that the urine incident is one that can be debated. I don't think he particularly wants to dwell on what it was and whether it was what we think it was too much. There are people who are encouraging him to do that, to sort of get to the bottom of it, talk to ASO, etc., etc. I think he just wants to move on from the last 24 hours, 48 hours, and the crash yesterday and the incidents today. But what most upset him was the booing, and he was booed almost throughout today's time trial, from the moment he stepped off the bus and to the moment he finished. It's not something he's experienced before. He said today that he always gets a few boos. I think he said at one point, I'd probably boo myself, but he was taken aback by the sort of venom of the reaction today.
It's a shame, isn't it? Because as a sport which has become so much more kind of the public and press access to the riders have become so much more controlled, and they all kind of look the same. They're hidden under the helmets and the sunglasses, and it's a real effort, not just for the print media but for television, to capture the character of riders. And in quite the same way that in the 80s and 90s, certainly when I was getting into the sport, you picked up a lot more on the temperament and the character of the riders, not just from the way they raced, but also because they were, they weren't quite so fiercely under the spotlight. So it's a shame that Cavendish, who is undoubtedly one of the biggest characters we've seen in the sport for ever. Yeah. It's a shame that
I mean, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, don't you? I mean, this is, I saw a wee Twitter conversation today with Peter Todd, his fiancée, talking to somebody about, on the one hand, this kind of incident is deplorable. On the other, there will be always people who... Cavendish is the divisive figure, isn't he? He polarises people. There will be people who don't like him, and we've spoken, I think, before about the fact that his manner, his attitude, you could call it arrogance, can wind people up. When you're winning, you get away with that. When things don't go so well for you, people don't wait for a second opportunity to go for you. And I think that with Cavendish, there's always a danger that if he's held to blame for a crash as he was yesterday, people will be quick to criticise him and have a go at him, and maybe that's just what we've seen today.
He's abrasive, he makes no... He makes fairly liberal use of fairly colourful language. Like you say, Rich, he does divide people. I think he's torn between wanting sort of justice on the incident yesterday, the crash, because he certainly feels that he was not necessarily in the right, but he wasn't in the wrong. But he's torn between that and just the desire for all this to be over. And the Tour de France is such a goldfish bowl that everything that happens is amplified many times over, and it assumes proportions which don't really reflect the proportions that these incidents would have in any other race and in sort of everyday life. So it's easy to get carried away and to want to react and to want to speak to the press and say, no, this is actually what happened. But then the danger is that will then prompt another reaction from the opposing side, etc., and it can just go on and on. He just wants to concentrate on the race. It's not been his best start to a Tour de France. I mean, he said today it's been the hardest start to a Tour de France generally, the actual racing, and I think he's just desperate to get on with the winning stages this week.
Well, you've got a very good chance tomorrow in Tour, I would have thought.
Yeah.
You're right about the sort of harshness of the microscope. If you're the story on the Tour de France, for 24 hours, that's quite an intense place to be, I would imagine. And you're sort of praying for another story to come along and replace that. And of course, with the overall situation in the race being pretty much tied up at the moment, everyone is going to seize even more so on any of these sort of side stories. So Cavendish's Cavendish, Greipel, Kittel being back in action in the sprint in Tour, everyone will be focusing on that and watching every move like hawks.
I mean, as a journalist, Cavendish is the gift that keeps on giving. At no point this morning would I have predicted that on the day of a time trial, the first time trial, that Cavendish would once again be the main story, but he kind of was in a way, partly because of what happened or didn't happen in the time trial, and partly because what happened to him was so outrageous and unprecedented. If he did have urine thrown at him, so he is the gift that keeps on giving from that point of view as a journalist, and long may he prosper.
The Tour de France with humansinvent.com. Innovation, craftsmanship and design.
One rider who did ride well today was Richie Porte from Team Sky, who finished fourth in the end. I think he wanted to show that he was recovered from his disappointing day on Sunday when he fell out of contention for the podium. Chatted to him a little bit about that. Apologies for the wind that you'll hear. It was extremely windy on the kind of marshlands where we were just at the finish, so the wind is whistling a little bit, but here's Richie Porte. You ride that, Rich. You fell out second overall, obviously, so what was your sort of strategy going into that time trial?
Obviously for me, I'm still disappointed in myself that Sunday worked out how it did, and I wanted to have a good time trial for the morale. 61 kilos, so on a time trial course like this, against the Tony Martins, I'm never going to beat them, but I think I came in at third, so I'm a minute 20 down on him, so I'm quite happy with it. But I'm pretty... I think the wind's changed. I think it's going to be good for someone like Friebe. Maybe not the stage, but I think he's going to give it a bit of a shake.
How did you feel? I mean, do you feel fully recovered from Sunday?
Yeah, the thing is that if sort of three teams gang up on you and they're kind of racing for second now, that's quite clear that they didn't want me back there, did they? So,
you think that's the decision they made?
I mean, obviously, it's not usual that you see, the Valverdes and Quintanas moving at 40 kilometres in. It's a race, I guess, and you can't expect any favours. But once I was gone, then I was never coming back. Then, I get close and look up, and there'd be full teams working on the front.
Are you ever any closer to understanding what happened?
Yeah,
Felt like that at the
I
start
think
of the stage?
what happened was just a special stage. I think obviously if we could have shut it down, it would have worked out a bit different, but we couldn't control the bunch. No sooner had we closed one dangerous attack and two more guys would go up the road. So, that's...
It was just chaos, was it?
It was chaos, but, it's the Tour and you should expect the unexpected, and that's kind of what we got.
You're listening to the Tour de France podcast with humansinvent.com and Sharp.
We've just been joined by Thomas Carrieux, the real power behind the throne at the Tour de France. Thomas,
definitely a more delicious meal than this one.
where's it happening?
That way, champagne cup, and then a small.
Is that with the badger? Is the badger there?
Himself is there. Yeah.
Are we invited? Is it his personal
You're invited,
invitation?
but I will make
Confiscate
the same thing.
my
Yes, like
recorder.
Jamie Pigeon.
Like Mark Cavendish.
I will give you back when you are finished.
Thanks, Thomas.
Press conference.
Okay.
This is a humansinvent.com Tour de France podcast with Richard Moore, Daniel Friebe and Lionel Birnie.
Sorry about that. We were interrupted by Thomas Carrieux, the press officer for the Tour de France, who's quite a character actually. I spent 3 weeks with him at the Tours of Qatar and Oman in February this year. Very similar to today actually, Tour of Qatar. Very sandy and dusty it was here today. Lionel, you're working through your Mont-Saint-Michel shaped dome of muscles.
They started life as a single or category mountain, a col of muscles, and now they've taken on the proportions of a two first cat, I would say, or maybe a first cat and a second cat, the second cat being the
I think the key is a high cadence, isn't it, Lionel?
That's absolutely right, Richard, yeah.
I noticed you've been adopting a high cadence while you get through these muscles.
Yeah, I wish I thought of that myself. It's all about keeping the pace up so that I don't notice that I'm getting full.
Okay, absolutely. I think we notice that you're getting full. So listen, we're gonna get really serious now because we're gonna talk politics. We need you for this, Lionel. Keep the muscles down. No, we're gonna talk a little bit about Brian Cookson. I spoke to Brian Cookson when he was at the Tour last week, and we're gonna play that interview in a moment. Brian Cookson is running against Pat McQuaid, the incumbent UCI president, for election. Now, Brian Cookson has been president of British cycling since, I think, 1997. He came in at a time of real difficulty for the British Federation when they were bankrupt, they were in turmoil. There was a big political kind of battle going on between Tony Doyle, who stood for president at one point, and the old board, and it was an organisation in crisis. I remember a famous quote from a certain Hein Verbruggen, who at the time was the UCI president, who described Great Britain as a black hole in the international cycling market, which is interesting given what's happened since. I think Brian Cookson came in as a safe pair of hands, and it is remarkable that he has, presided for as long as he has, and over a period of such incredible change in that organisation. They've gone from, I think when he took over as president, they had 12,000 or 13,000 members. They now have approaching 80,000 members, I believe. And obviously the huge success. Now, a lot of that is down to the lottery funding that came in. But I know you've had dealings with Brian Cookson over the years, Lionel. What are your impressions of Brian Cookson, the man?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there when you described him as a safe pair of hands, because Brian is, I don't want to damn him with faint praise by saying he's a steady captain, because he has overseen a period of remarkable development, not just in terms of British success at the Olympics, but also in growing the sport, getting the velodrome up and running in Manchester. seeing cycling's rise in the UK to its position now, which is where it's just below kind of the core sports which you would identify as kind of part of the fabric of British culture: football, rugby, cricket. And
elbowed his way in there, hasn't it?
Cycling has, and but he's not somebody who kind of behaves in a very conservative way. When he talks to the media about a controversial issue, he's not frightened to actually address it head on. And he's quite PR savvy, as I think we'll hear from your interview with him, in that he can anticipate how things are going to play out, particularly with the media. And I think that's been one of his strengths, actually, in that he has been able to spot choppy waters ahead and kind of preempt any sort of difficult vibes coming British cycling's way.
Yeah, my impression is that he was, and he goes into this in the interview, but I think that you can contrast him quite markedly with Pat McQuaid, who I don't think many people would describe as a safe pair of hands. I think he's been unfortunate in some respects, but possibly where he's been most unfortunate, and it's of his own doing, is in his association with the previous president, Hein Verbruggen, and the period that he presided over, which was from, I think, 91 to 2005, when I think we can say now that was a period when the use of EPO and doping in general was, a blind eye was turned, and it became out of control.
Oui, terminé, oui, merci.
Merci. The muscles are gone. Lionel's admitted defeat with the muscles.
Well, some of the ones at the bottom aren't quite open. So I'm playing
safe. It's a grand tour. You can't take a risk. You've got to look after your muscles.
Right. Endlessly riveting crustacean punditry tonight.
Yeah. Anything to say about Brian Cookson, Daniel?
Not a huge amount, Richard, because I don't know him, so I
don't
really.
But what are your thoughts about him standing against Pat McQuaid, who you do obviously know a little bit?
It's about regime change, isn't it? That's what cycling needs desperately. It needs to, I think that Pat McQuaid does have some responsibilities in the negative things happening in cycling at the moment, but really. It's unfortunately for him. I don't think it's about that at the moment with the elections. I think it's about a clean slate really, and Brian Cookson is the best person to sort of symbolise.
I think
that.
what he's been good at with British cycling, my impression is he's been good at letting people get on with their jobs as well. Most obvious example being Dave Brailsford, before him Peter Keane. And again, Peter Keane came in very determined to run things his own way. Actually, he actually sort of created his own conflicts with the board, such as when they came up with the green jersey. They started racing in green jersey. That he told me a few years ago was a deliberate sort of deliberate.
It was a break with the past,
asserting his authority, and he knew it would rub up against the board, and it was a battle that he knew that he had to win in order to establish a precedent for going forward. And I think Cookson was very good at empowering him, and also Brailsford. Now, there are obviously questions about his links with a World Tour team, Team Sky. And as you'll hear in the interview, I asked him about that, and as well as some of his plans if he is elected. Brian, you're out on the campaign trail, I guess, for your bid to become UCI president. You launched your manifesto a couple of weeks ago in Paris. How's that gone down? How's the reception been to that?
Yeah, I think it's been really, really very positive. Maybe some French journalists were a little bit negative, but, I'm quite happy to be scrutinised and to answer questions, and it's right that people are sceptical at the start.
It does seem to have turned a little bit sour, not perhaps so much from your end, but some of the responses from Pat McQuaid, the current president, have turned the campaign slightly sour. Is that your impression as well, or?
Well, I think it's regrettable when people sort of throw mud around and innuendos, and the thing that I've been most disappointed about has been that, and of that, very disappointing is this rumour that's flying around that my campaign is funded by Mr. Makarov. What a load of rubbish, I mean, everything that we're doing is funded from within British Cycling. We've got some great people working there, our website people, our comms people, and we've got some external advice from Vero, who are really exceptionally experienced consultants in that kind of thing. So there's no need for any funding, there's nothing sinister about it at all. I've got some good people working with me, and we're presenting our case straight, and we'll continue to do so.
What prompted you to decide to run? Because you've obviously been involved with the management committee the last couple of years. You did until quite recently say that you were supportive of Pat McQuaid. What prompted you in the end to run for president?
Well, I think, when you're on a committee or a board, then you've got a responsibility to abide by collective responsibility and to try and stabilise things after January, when things were still pretty hairy. I thought it was important that we remained united, and that I was asked a question, a kind of leading question, as you journalists do. Are you still supporting Pat McQuaid? And there's only three possible answers to that, aren't there? You say yes, and the headline is Cookson supporting McQuaid. You say no, and it's Cookson, is undermining McQuaid. And if I say no comment, I say Cookson tight-lipped on the subject of McQuaid. So you can't win, really. But what I thought over, in the period after that, it was important to try and let Pat stabilise the situation, move things forward, try and resolve some of the issues. And in my opinion, it's got worse, not better. And the UCI's own consultation stakeholder process came out quite clearly saying that essentially the problem is the image of the UCI and the image of its leadership. And the writing's there on the wall, and so that was when we got into the election process, and I said, right, okay, I'm willing to be a candidate.
You've been calling recently for Pat McQuaid to reveal the details of his remuneration in his post. Is that something that you feel could be a vote loser for him if that comes out?
Well, I've not called for him to reveal his remuneration. That's a matter for him. What I've said is that if I'm elected, I'll reveal what I'm paid. I think it's Pat himself that has told journalists that he won't reveal it, and that's a matter for him. I just think what's the problem there? I think the members of the federations around the world have the right to know. I don't have a problem with it.
How does it work? Obviously, the post will be voted by the federations. So is a lot of your work at the moment, is it going around meeting the various presidents of the federations and telling them what you're all about?
Yeah, absolutely. All the presidents of every federation around the world and all the continental confederations got copies of my manifesto, English, French, Spanish, and as many other languages as we could afford to do. We sent that information around. The voting structure is a bit complicated because it's via the continent. So Europe has 14 votes, Africa has 7, Asia has 9, Pan America has 9, Oceania has 3. So the job for me now is to go out and talk to those people, as many of those people as I can, and find out what the issues are and listen, because that's what the UCI has been very bad at doing in the past.
Presumably you did a bit of work in that regard before you announced your candidacy. I mean, so are you quite confident there's a lot of support potentially out there?
Oh, I'm pretty confident there's support. I wouldn't put my head above the parapet if I thought it was going to be a complete disaster. I'm confident that there are already people out there who will support me, and I'm confident that the groundswell will go my way as things emerge.
One thing that people have raised as a potential issue is obviously your close links with British Cycling and Team Sky.
Yeah.
How do you put people's concerns at rest that there may be a conflict of interest there?
Well, I've already stepped to one side my links with Team Sky, and I was always only a member of the operating board, which is a joint liaison group between British Cycling and Sky. So I don't have any shares in Sky, I don't have any financial interest in it or anything like that. And if I'm elected, I'll also have to, under the regulations, the Constitution, I'll have to step aside from being the president of British Cycling as well. So, if and when I'm elected, all of those things will be put to one side, and I'll be president for the Union Cycliste Internationale, not a British president and not a British person, and not have any links with Sky at all.
This is the humansinvent.com Tour de France podcast, powered by Sharp.
So here we are, still awaiting our main courses, and that was Brian Cookson you heard from there. Lionel, I believe you were tarting yourself around the international media today talking about Brian Cookson.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, there was a guy from German radio who seemed to be going from table to table, trying to find somebody who knew who Brian Cookson was and could perhaps give their listeners a little bit of information as to his background. because obviously we've got this two-way fight now for the UCI presidency between Pat McQuaid and Brian Cookson. It's a shame, in my opinion, that there isn't a third candidate just to offer, just to make it a bit more entertaining.
Could be you.
Lionel Birnie for UCI president.
Where would we start?
You're quite presidential.
But
the way you ate those mussels was quite presidential, I think.
Thank you. I'll put that in my manifesto. The key, I think, from the line of questioning that was put to me was all about this kind of question of conflict of interest. The fact that Brian Cookson is British cycling president, the fact he has this link with Team Sky. Will this lead to Britain becoming overly powerful in the cycling universe, as he put it? It's an extremely valid point. But as Daniel says, the key at the moment is to break the cycle of Verbruggen-McQuaid, which really is the same presidency. It's just. I know he really objects to this.
Same urine, different container to use.
Yeah, but McQuaid really objects to this notion that he is Verbruggen's puppet. But looking at the way certain things have happened over the last.
And whether he is or he isn't, the key issue is that is the perception, and an awful lot of nonsense, or an awful lot of noise and controversy and conjecture that's unhelpful to cycling is generated by that perception that he is behind Verbruggen's puppet. Perhaps, unfortunately for Pat McQuaid, perhaps that's not the case, but frankly we could do without all that wasted time debating whether that is the case or not.
I think the problem for a governing body is it's a bit like a referee in a football match. They should be they should be there, but they shouldn't be noticed too much.
Yeah.
They should be just in a very authoritative but quite quiet way governing the sport. And I think with Brian Cookson, that's pretty much what he's done with British cycling. But one of the key points is that Cookson very quickly needs to explain exactly how he will, what his roles will be at British Cycling. I know he's already said he would cut ties with Team Sky, because one of the issues with the McQuaid presidency has been the matter of conflict of interest, with his son Andrew being an agent and with his brother being in charge of race promoting. Obviously, Brian Cookson's son Oliver's had a role at Team Sky, not a senior role in any sense of the imagination, but nevertheless, one of the issues in cycling is that people seem to be able to dismiss a conflict of interest just by saying, "Oh, but there isn't one." Whereas actually, as Daniel says, it's more about perception, and particularly with trust being so low in so many areas of cycling. This is an opportunity for Cookson to come in and make some bold moves. And I would have thought if he gains the support he needs to win the election, that's pretty much what he'll do. But he won't do it in a really demonstrative way. He'll do it quite calmly and quietly.
Daniel, did you have something to add at that?
No, just that I know, Rich, you've quibbled with this, but I spoke to a couple of team managers in the last week who have suggested that Brian Cookson at the moment is a little preoccupied with winning the election. Of course, he has to be, because without that he can't do anything. But they've heard more from him about what Pat McQuaid is doing wrong and what he needs to do to win the election than what he will actually do when he's president.
Yeah, my perception has been, and I did ask him about the sourness of the campaign. My perception has been that when he announced his candidacy, the reaction from McQuaid was very personal. He came out with the accusation that Cookson's campaign was being funded by the Russians, by Makarov, and things like that. He made it very personal, and it's kind of continued in that tone. One of the problems, of course, that we have in cycling is the fact that we still have deeply involved in the sport and in positions of great responsibility, people who are very associated with doping, and one of those people is Bjarne Riis, and I think, Daniel, you did an interview, which you're going to hear now, about Riis and about the future of his team.
Yeah, I had a chat with one of the most experienced Danish journalists on the race, a guy called Brian Askvig from Ekstrabladet, which is one of the main Danish newspapers. And I became aware very early in this tour that there was, the pressure is mounting on Riis from the Danish press. They've certainly been. There's been a bit of a sort of cold war between them on this tour, and I asked Brian about that, and what are the prospects for Saxo Bank with Rees at the helm? So, Brian, I understand that the Danish press and Danish public were fairly surprised, fairly mystified by the lack of Danish riders in the Saxo Bank team.
Everybody had expected that at least a couple of riders would be in here, Danish riders, Nicky Sorensen and Chris Anker Sorensen. Everybody were expecting them to be here, and a lot of people were even thinking that Mirko, who rode in the polka dot jersey last year for a week, would be here as well. So it was kind of surprising. There was a bit of an uproar with some editors in the newspapers who said that, well, this could be Rees saying, shut up everybody about all the criticism and what's been there. Personally, I think that Rees simply took the best team that he could.
Really? But Rees is definitely a man under pressure, isn't he? There's been a constant, well, for years now, but even over the last few months, there's just been a background rumble of, scrutiny and controversy and pressure, and it seems to be building now.
Absolutely, especially after the Hamilton book in last year, and also the USADA investigation, all what happened in the US. Pressure building up, and he didn't do anything too much about this. Actually, he ignored press, I guess the international press, and for sure the Danish press, for 9 months. And when he came to the tour on Monday and finally stood up in front of all the reporters, he said absolutely nothing. So this, of course, leaves space for speculation and also criticism.
And do you, Brian, think that there is any escape for him now? Is there any way out of this for Bjarne Riis?
Well, the big question, of course, is way out of what? He put himself in a position where he's very much, there's a constant battle going on between him and the press. There's always been this suspicion against him, even after 2007 when he admitted his own doping use as a rider. Yeah. Even since then, there's been this suspicion against him and the team, and of course Tyler's story. Now Michael Rasmussen has also admitted that he was doped, Van der Velde, Zabriskie, and so on. So it doesn't make it any better, and the way he acts with the press just doesn't make it any better. We don't know if he had anything to do with all this, but what everybody needs to hear from him and needs to believe, of course, is that he actually was misled by these riders, as he claims more or less that he was. The big question is can we trust what we see and what he says? And I think that he'll have a hard time finding a way out of that situation with the mistrust.
I can imagine, Brian. I've read his book in English, and people would have felt as though they forgave him once and they gave him a chance once and they believed him. When it seemed as though he'd finally turned around and spilled the beans basically on what he'd done. And I think they'll probably have a hard time giving him a second chance.
Yeah, that of course that would destroy everything for him if it turned out that he had something to do with, for example, Hamilton, what he did in 2002 and 3. I think that Michael Rasmussen rode there in the team in 2002. Well, they have admitted to massive doping, the use of doping, and if Riis knew about this, and Jörg, the German rider, says that Riis knew about everything, rumor has it that Michael Rasmussen, he's writing a book, and rumor has it that he will in this book, almost repeat what Jörg had always said. And if this is true, then of course it will be very, very difficult for people to so to speak forgive him, because Bjarne Riis is the biggest name in Danish cycling. He has been since the early 1990s, and he still is. And he has a huge group of followers. And I think that if this turns out to be true, or if he doesn't manage to turn things around, I think that it will be very difficult for him to keep his position in the Danish, in Denmark. Yeah.
Okay, here we are, still overlooking Mont-Saint-Michel. Main courses have arrived. I've got salmon. Lionel has got cod. Delicious. Now we've got a few pieces of business to take care of. The first one, outstanding piece of business, is competition winner correctly predicting Sunday's stage winner and winning a copy of the cycling anthology. It's GNM, Twitter handle at GNM74. So if whoever you are, GNM, if you could tweet Lionel Birnie, at Lionel Birnie, and he will arrange for you to get a copy of the cycling anthology. Well, obviously, we've got to do our Peddler de Charme.
And now, Peddler de Charme.
Thank you for that, Chiro. Well, we had a couple of nominations on Twitter, and we're going to encourage people to please nominate their Peddler de Charme or Peddler sans charme. Jen Loves Cycling, who won the David Miller phone call, she nominated Tony Martin as today's Peddler de Charme, a good suggestion. And Christopher Davis nominated Lawrence Tendam as Peddler sans charme for obvious reasons. He's not the most stylish time trialist, is he? Daniel, any nominees?
Totally unrelated to anything that happened today, but I quite enjoy Andreas, the juxtaposition of Andreas Kloden's total flagrant lack of charm off the bike and his silky smooth pedalling style. No?
Yeah.
But poor old Claude is he is a fading force, finally.
Well, he is 48.
156. Today he finished 69th, 3:42.
Oh, he would have hammered this a few years ago, wouldn't he, in the old days?
Yeah.
Formerly second on the tour, although that makes him the rightful winner that year. Was it 2004? He was second?
Yes.
To Lance Armstrong, who has been stripped of his titles. So does that make Andreas Kloden the winner of the 2004 tour? Lionel, any suggestions for Peddler de Charme?
Well, I'm going to probably make a bit of a mess of the pronunciation, but Michael Kwiatkowski, the Polish champion riding for Amiga Pharma, looked great in the time trial today. Obviously, we've seen him doing some pretty impressive stuff on the front in the lead up to the lead outs. He's climbed well, and there he is. I mean, look how high he is after two mountain stages and a time trial, 7th overall. I mean, that is seriously impressive.
Young lad as well. A little shout out for Chris Froome, who I remember David Miller last year described him as looking like he was riding a motorbike that was going too fast for him. And I was struck today by how smooth he was actually on the time trial bike. I know he spent a little bit of time in the wind tunnel recently. I don't think enough to have really ironed out any roughness, but he's pretty steady actually. He's powerful. He's a tall rider, and I thought he looked quite impressive. So that's Peddler de Charme. Pick one from the aforementioned. We had a discussion last night on the podcast about the whole issue of power wattages and using these estimates and calculations to determine whether performances were suspicious or not. Daniel's screwing up his face as though he's sucking a lemon. We're not going to talk about it again, Daniel. Calm down.
You love that subject.
I don't love the subject. Well, all you want to talk about are exciting young Frenchmen.
I just interviewed one.
Exciting.
No longer promising. Roman Seacard, former under-23 world champion.
Yeah. What's happened to him?
Sort of his career is kind of fizzling at the moment. He's had bad injuries due to poorly adjusted cleats, and it's taken him an awfully long time to get over that. And he's doing okay in this Tour de France, but fairly anonymous so far. And of course, his future is very much in doubt because he's got one more year with Askvig, but it's looking increasingly likely that they won't be around next year.
First Spanish Basque to sign for Euskaltel, wasn't he? He's Basque, but from the French side of the border.
Was he the first?
I thought he was the first. I could be wrong. His contemporaries were Arthur Vichot was in that team with him in the World Championships that he won. Thibaut Pinot was possibly as well. So he's fallen behind those two guys. Vichot is the French champion, of course. So I'm just going to read a few tweets from people about last night's discussion. Ben Elshaw pointed out the fact that people are not allowing for the people that calculate the supposed figures are not allowing for external factors, wind, temperature, teammates, previous climbs, previous stages. Ridiculous, he says. Spooky Doki blog says we've got 15 years of clouded data and little human input data from other sports, so nobody knows. Ian White, on the basis that they are estimates, then scientific validity cannot be guaranteed, ergo waste of effort by hypothesizing.
Are you only reading out the comments that you agree with?
No, this was actually the quite a big consensus. I did have some interaction with people who had different views. Ross Tucker is somebody who will be familiar to people on Twitter. He runs Science of Sport website, and he's written at length on this whole subject. And he does come up with his own calculations, but he puts them in. He tries to explain the context a little bit more than some other people, and he writes in a very measured way on the subject. Definitely worth a look. Martin McAvoy sent about 300 tweets. I'll read a few of them because they were quite interesting. The thing that strikes me is a tendency to say Rider A put out 400 watts or 5.8 watts per kilogram. No, they didn't. The effect of their effort translates to that, but no machine, least of all a bike, has ever been invented that 100% translates energy expended to effort. The power actually being produced is almost certainly vastly greater than the numbers quoted, which are effective effort, not actual effort, and thus no discussion is ever had over efficiency of conversion of human power output to effective power. Interesting, Tim Kerrison spoke about that the other night, spoke about how inefficient the human body is. It's only about 20% efficient or something, he said. So that's interesting. More from Mark McAvoy, because this did interest me, and I don't know, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not sure about the validity of this, but this is what he said. I doubt it's true, but let's take a silly example. Tim Kerrison's an ex-swimming coach used to dealing with shape resistance. Let's say, for a silly, not true example, that Tim Kerrison works out that Froome's ungainly style, while bad for wind resistance, bizarrely allows him to translate his basic 10 watts per kilogram at an efficiency rate of 69% as opposed to standard 59%, and bang, Chris is mutant, to use the terminology of Antoine Vere, because his real effort is exactly the same, but his effective real-world output is 6.9 watts per kilogram. I hope you followed that. I think I did. But it's an interesting theory, and there are lots of very interesting theories out there.
There are, yeah, and it's a question that is going to be asked more and more, because people are, I think somebody pointed out on Twitter, the reason this debate, or part of the reason this debate is coming up is because there is still a lack of trust in the...
Jeremy Whittle pointed
It was Jeremy Whittle, yeah, our colleague Jeremy Whittle pointed out there's a lack of trust in the anti-doping measures and tests and biological passport. Can we be sure that it's that the holes in the net are close enough together, small enough holes in the net to catch
at least some fish.
To at least catch some fish, yeah. And
so that's as a salmon and this cod.
Well, my cod has vanished. It's escaped. So it is a question that's relevant. It's a question that's going to be asked more and more. But as you've been pointing out, Richard, we don't really have enough data. We don't really know. Not only do we not know some of the variables that we were talking about in last night's podcast, but also we don't really know. We don't have a golden figure that demonstrates whether somebody is doping or not. So if we were to prove that somebody was putting out 6.2 watts per kilogram of body weight, that means doping. We're not even at that point.
Well, we have a lot of clouded data. As that tweeter commented, please keep tweeting us. As I mentioned earlier, there's some really good cycling content on humansinvent.com. We're going to be running more competitions. Daniel, let's offer a copy of your wonderful... No, not a phone call from you. We were going to offer a phone call from Chiro to somebody. We're going to try and organise a phone call from Chiro to somebody. So we'll sort that out for next week. Let's offer a copy of one of Daniel's wonderful books.
I haven't got any copies.
Mountain High. No, you don't have to have them with you.
How am I going to send them?
Well, you can send them when you get home. That's what we're going to do. Okay. So, would you like to select Mountain High or The Cannibal, both of which are excellent works?
Whatever anyone wants. I'll send both.
Both? Brilliant. What's the competition? Guess the winner of tomorrow's stage by 1 p.m. UK time. Guess second place.
Guess the weight of Lionel Birnie.
Before or after this meal?
After.
Power to weight. His power to weight 1.5. Negative.
Very generous.
Negative 6.5. Guess second place on tomorrow's stage.
Yes. Okay.
Guess 38th place on tomorrow's
No,
stage.
don't be daft.
No?
No.
Makes it more of a lottery, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so first or second tomorrow?
No, I like the idea of 38.
38th?
No, it's too difficult, isn't it?
No one will get it.
that. But with the winner.
I don't know anyone who's
simple.
targeting
Let's
38th.
Rich,
Why are we
let's
taking
keep-
so long on this?
Let's keep it simple and wrap this podcast
Okay,
up.
so please tweet at FreeBoss.
No.
No? Please tweet at Humans Invent with your guess for tomorrow's stage winner and stand a chance of winning Mountain High and Eddie Merckx Cannibal. That's all for us tonight.
Yes, it is. But before we go, first of all, apologies
yes.
for the background noise. We decided to record over dinner because it's the first time we've finished before 10 o'clock this week, and it's turned into quite a bustling, busy restaurant.
Well, it's not that busy. The waiters are just very noisy.
That's true, yeah, actually. Just before we go, a big thanks to everyone who has not only listened to the podcast, but also to the people who have made it possible, and that includes Jasper Credland of Sharp, Nigel Brown of Humans Invent, and to our wonderful editor, John Mooney. Thank you.